Imagine waking up one day and your country is gone. Not invaded, not destroyed, just gone. Kicked out, told to figure it out on your own. That is exactly what happened to Singapore in 1965. They were thrown out of Malaysia, a small island with no natural resources, no army, no water supply, and no real reason to exist as an independent nation. Today, Singapore has a GDP per capita higher than the United States, Germany, and Japan. Its airport is consistently ranked the best in the world. Its passport lets you into 193 countries visa-free, and its citizens enjoy one of the highest standards of living on the planet. So how did a tiny island, 50 kilometers wide, go from third world to first world in a single generation? And more importantly, why can't anyone else just copy what they did? Let's get into it. To understand Singapore's success, you first have to understand just how bad things looked at the start. In 1965, Singapore was separated from Malaysia and it wasn't a celebration. It was a crisis. Singapore's first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, literally cried on national television when he made the announcement. He called it a moment of anguish. The island had no oil, no farmland, no minerals. Its only resource was its location. Sitting right at the tip of the Malay Peninsula at one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. That was it. The unemployment rate was sky high. Riots between ethnic Chinese and Malays had torn the country apart. British military bases, which employed a huge chunk of the population, were closing down. Corruption was everywhere. Housing was a disaster, with people crammed into slums with no clean water or electricity. If you were betting on which country would become one of the richest in the world, Singapore would not have been your pick. We were the odd ones out. Nobody expected us to survive, let alone succeed. Lee Kuan Yew. What changed everything was leadership, specifically Lee Kuan Yew, known simply as LKY. Love him or criticize him, LKY was one of the most effective leaders of the 20th century. He was a Cambridge-educated lawyer who understood economics, law, and above all, psychology. He knew that for Singapore to survive, it had to make itself useful to the world. His logic was simple. Singapore had no resources, so it had to become a resource for global trade, for manufacturing, for finance, for talent. And he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen, even if it meant making very unpopular decisions. The first thing LKY did was go to war against corruption, and he meant it literally. He raised civil servant salaries dramatically. His reasoning, if you pay government workers well, they don't need to take bribes. Then he set up the CPIB, the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, with real teeth. It could investigate anyone, ministers, judges, police chiefs, no one was untouchable. And to prove he was serious, he prosecuted his own friends, people who had helped him rise to power. He sent a message that was impossible to misread. In Singapore, the rules apply to everyone. The result, Singapore went from being one of the most corrupt countries in Asia to one of the least corrupt in the world. Today, it consistently ranks in the top 5 on global corruption indexes, right alongside Denmark and New Zealand. Clean government became Singapore's biggest competitive advantage. Foreign investors noticed immediately. If you put your factory or your headquarters in Singapore, you knew you wouldn't have to bribe anyone. You wouldn't have a local official showing up with his hand out. That was rare in the 1960s and 70s, and it was priceless. While most developing countries in the 1960s were going in the opposite direction, nationalizing industries, closing off to foreign companies, protecting local businesses, Singapore did something radical. It opened up completely. LKY personally flew to meet CEOs of major American and European corporations. He told them, come to Singapore, set up your factories here, bring your capital and your technology. We will give you low taxes, excellent infrastructure, a rule of law, and a government that will not interfere with your business. It worked. Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, General Electric, they all came. And they brought jobs, tens of thousands of them, that lifted Singapore's working class into the middle class within a decade. Singapore became a manufacturing hub, then upgraded to higher value electronics, then moved into financial services services, pharmaceuticals, and technology. Each decade, it climbed one rung higher on the economic ladder. Here is one of Singapore's most unusual policies and one of its most effective. Every working person in Singapore is required to contribute a large percentage of their salary to something called the Central Provident Fund or CPF. Your employer also contributes. This money goes into your personal account and can be used for housing, healthcare, and retirement. This isn't optional, it's mandatory. The effect was huge. Singapore built up enormous national savings. People had skin in the game. They owned their homes, they had retirement money, they had something to lose. This created a culture of personal responsibility and financial stability that most countries can only dream of. And because people could use their CPF savings to buy government-built housing, HDB flats, the home ownership rate in Singapore rose to over 90%. Think about that. 9 out of 10 Singaporeans own their home. In comparison, the rate in the UK is about 65% and in Germany, it's just 49%. From the very beginning, LKY understood that Singapore's only real resource was its people. So the government invested massively in education. Schools were built, teachers were trained and paid competitively, meritocracy was the rule. It didn't matter what race you were or who your parents were. If you were smart and you worked hard, you would get ahead. Singapore sent its best students abroad to study at the world's top universities, then brought them back with attractive salaries and positions in government and business. The civil service became a place where the brightest minds wanted to work, not because it was boring and safe, but because it was genuinely challenging and well paid. Today, Singapore's students consistently rank at the very top of international education rankings in mathematics, science, and reading. Year after year, Singapore and its neighbors are at the top of the PISA rankings, which measures educational performance across countries. Singapore's infrastructure is not just good, it is a model for the world. Its mass rapid transit system, the MRT, is clean, reliable, and covers the entire island. Its airport, Shanghai, has been voted the world's best airport for more than a decade. The port of Singapore is one of the busiest in the world. Its roads are managed with electronic pricing that controls congestion. Even something as basic as water, something Singapore had none of in 1965, importing it all from Malaysia, was solved through decades of engineering investment. Today, Singapore has 4 national taps: imported water, local catchment water, recycled water called new water, and desalinated seawater. It is now water independent. All of this infrastructure sends a signal to the world. This is a place where things work, where your goods will move efficiently, where your employees will live well. Come here. Now, it would be dishonest to talk about Singapore's success without talking about what it cost. Singapore is not a liberal democracy in the Western sense. The People's Action Party, Lee Kuan Yew's party, has won every single election since independence. Every single one. Critics, and there are many, say the government uses defamation laws and other legal tools to suppress political opposition. Newspapers are tightly controlled, public protests require permits that are rarely granted. Chewing gum was famously banned for years to keep the city clean. Drug trafficking can be a death penalty offense. LKY never really apologized for any of this. He believed that for a small, diverse, fragile country, social order and economic growth had to come before personal freedom. Whether you agree with that trade-off or not, it is a real trade-off. Singapore's wealth did not come free. There is also the question of inequality. Singapore has one of the highest income inequalities in the developed world, as measured by the Gini coefficient. The gap between the wealthy elite, many of them foreigners, and lower income Singaporean workers is significant and growing. Singaporeans themselves will often tell you that life there is incredibly stressful. The education system, for all its success, is brutally competitive. Children as young as 6 are sorted by exam results. The term kaisu, a Hokkaian word meaning the fear of losing, is basically a national characteristic. There is real debate among Singaporeans about whether the system prioritizes economic output over human happiness. Surveys consistently show that Singaporeans work some of the longest hours in the world. Burnout is common, the birth rate has collapsed. Singapore has one of the lowest fertility rates on earth, partly because young people feel they cannot afford the time or money to have children. This is a country that solved poverty and achieved prosperity, but it is still working out what comes next. Now, why you can't just copy Singapore? The most obvious reason is size. Singapore is a city-state. It has 5.9 million people in an area smaller than many major cities. Managing a country that small is fundamentally different from managing a nation of 50 million, 200 million, or 1.4 billion people. In Singapore, the government can make a decision on Monday and implement it across the entire country by Friday. There are no regional politics, no states with their own budgets and agendas, no massive rural population with completely different needs from the urban one. The scale of complexity is just incomparably smaller. If you try to run India or Nigeria or Brazil like Singapore, you would fail. Not because the ideas are wrong, but because the size makes them unworkable. Singapore's location was not a choice, it was a gift. Sitting at the Strait of Malacca, through which roughly 40% of global trade passes, Singapore had a natural strategic advantage that no amount of good governance can create from scratch. Countries that are landlocked or far from major shipping routes or located in unstable regions simply don't have that card to play. Singapore got lucky with its geography. Then it played that hand brilliantly, but the hand had to exist first. Singapore developed at a very specific moment in history. The post-World War II boom, when global trade was exploding, American corporations were looking to expand into Asia, and the rules of international business were being written in ways that favored open economies. That window is not open in the same way today. The world has changed. Supply chains are being regionalized. Trade wars are becoming normal. The strategy of open everything and let the multinationals in works very differently in a world of geopolitical competition between the US and China. Countries trying to follow Singapore's playbook today are operating in a very different environment. And then there is the most uncomfortable reason. Culture. Singapore's culture, shaped by its mix of Chinese, Malay, Indian, and British influences, happened to align very well with certain economic values. Hard work, deference to authority, respect for education, long-term thinking, and high savings rates. That is not a judgment about any other culture, it is simply a recognition that Singapore's particular cultural cocktail fit very neatly with what LKY was trying to build. In another cultural context, some of his policies would have been rejected or simply not worked the same way. Culture is not something government can easily change. It is built over generations. Singapore didn't manufacture its culture to fit its economic model. The two happened to be compatible in a way that was partly luck. Finally, and this is important, many of Singapore's most effective policies were possible precisely because the government could impose them without meaningful democratic opposition. Mandatory savings, most democratic governments would struggle to push that through. Massive land acquisition to build public housing, hugely controversial in most countries. Controlling the press, unthinkable in most Western democracies. The uncomfortable truth is that some of what made Singapore work was the ability to make long-term decisions without worrying about losing the next election. That is a feature of authoritarian governance, and it comes with serious costs to freedom and accountability that most people rightly don't want to pay. Now, even if you can't copy Singapore, you can learn from it. Clean governance matters enormously. Countries that reduce corruption unlock economic growth almost immediately. The benefits are not subtle. Foreign investment flows in, businesses that were operating informally come above ground, tax revenues increase. Long-term thinking matters. Singapore's leaders made decisions that would not pay off for 20 or 30 years, and they stayed in power long enough to see them through. Most democratic governments struggle to think beyond the next election cycle. Fixing this is one of the great unsolved problems of modern governance. Infrastructure is not just concrete, it is a signal. When a country has excellent infrastructure, it tells businesses and investors, we are serious, we can be trusted, come and build here. And investing in people, in education, in healthcare, in housing is not charity, it is economics. A healthy, educated, housed population is a productive population. Singapore proved this beyond any reasonable doubt. Singapore is a miracle. There is really no other word for it. In 50 years, it went from a city that people were not sure would survive to one of the most admired nations on earth. But it is a miracle that came from a very specific combinations of ingredients. A brutal starting point, an extraordinary leader with an iron will, a perfect geographical location, a fortuitous moment in history, a compatible culture, and a government willing to make decisions that democratic governments often cannot. You cannot order those ingredients online. You cannot install them with a policy memo. What you can do is take the lessons seriously: governance, education, infrastructure, long-term thinking, and apply them in ways that fit your own country, your own culture, your own moment in history. Singapore will never be replicated, but the ideas that made it great, those are available to anyone willing to do the hard work. Singapore didn't just get rich, it proved that destiny is not geography. With the right leadership and the right choices, a nation can rewrite its own story. Now, if you want to know why Singapore got expelled from Malaysia, then you can watch this video showing up on your screen. Thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button. Bye.